All right, so we are on week 8, and let's take a look at what we're going to do. So, hi everybody, it's good to be back. See you all again. I've begun the grading process. I know I'm weeks and weeks behind, and so just be a little more patient with me, and I'm getting there. I started yesterday, and I'll keep on trucking until I get through. For next week, your annotated bibliography and annotated articles in your proposal are due. So I've just repeated here what was on your syllabus, the choices that you have. Most of you, I imagine, are going to do a review paper, which is fine. You take one aspect of second language acquisition that we have discussed and talk about that with a minimum of 12 to 15 references. You can also do a research proposal or research report. I think most of you won't, obviously it's too, there's not enough time for you at this point to put together a research report. So that would only be if you already had something that you were working on. A research proposal is fine if you've worked on your data analyses and other things and then thought that there's a project that you might want to do with data, then you can certainly put together a research proposal instead of doing a review paper. So what have you guys thought about doing? Diego, what do you think you're going to do?
I like the research proposal. I think I need more of a background on what I would want to do. So a review paper that morphs into a research proposal would probably be my best bet.
Sounds good to me. So do you have an area that you're interested in?
I like third language acquisition.
Third language acquisition.
Multiple known languages.
Yeah, multiple lingualism.
How it interacts with the new.
Nice. That's a nice area and a pretty new one to our field. Basically, SLA has focused almost exclusively until quite recently on bilingualism. But now there's a lot more out there on multilingualism. So that's a nice area to pick. And what you want to do, Diego, is come up with some kind of question, right? So in other words, a focus. It doesn't have to be an actual question, but it has to be a focus. Like, what is it about multilingualism that you're interested in? That was a question.
Oh. Well, one of the things right off my top of my head would be different personalities that one develops as a speaker of a different language.
Oh, interesting.
For example, my Spanish person is a lot more quiet
than your English person.
Right. I don't have any actual theories as to why that is, but looking at the literature, seeing what it is.
Start with take a look at someone called Aneta Pavlenko. She has done some work on that. So I forget exactly the name of the book, but she has done some work on exactly that, like how, I think it's more like how can be how emotions are felt and so on in different languages. So anyway, it's along those lines. So go ahead and start with her and let me know if you're running into trouble, okay? Robbie, what have you thought?
I'm really interested in child acquisition of a child that's trying to learn a language.
A second language?
Yes. Not really a second, like trying to learn the language, like the person is exposed, the child is exposed to maybe multiple languages, like two languages precisely. Because I look at some of the kids that I have in my environment, and I'm like, sometimes the way they speak, they are mixing codes from
Codes.
So I'm really interested in that, but I know that's a lot of work I've been doing there.
Well, it's not just that, it's also that's not exactly in the purview of the class. So there's another class that we have that deals with bilingual, so simultaneous bilingual children, because that has more in common with first language acquisition than it does with second language acquisition. Now, I could make an exception for that if it's the one thing that you're super interested in. But it's of course not anything that we've discussed here, because we don't do bilingualism with children. So I'm also a little, I prefer you to do something that generated sort of from the work that we've been doing in second language acquisition rather than first language acquisition. Now, second language acquisition would include non-simultaneous bilingual children. So that would be sort of like the Norwegian and the Japanese kid that we did in data analysis 1. So that would be an area, if there was something that you were interested in child second language acquisition as opposed to adult. But bilingual code switching doesn't quite fit. So let's think about, I know that you and I are going to talk, so let's think about something that that might fit a little better. But yeah, for everybody outside, you're really looking for something that's been generated from the work that we've been doing here. Now, one of the reasons I gave you the reading for this week, the non-language factors, was because I thought some of you may be interested in doing things like affect, personality styles, learning strategies, everything that doesn't have to do with straight up and down linguistic theory, which is exactly why we're doing it today. So it may be that after you've done the reading and after we've discussed it from today, there might be something in that work that work on individual differences that you find interesting. Okay, good. So Lupe, you and I will talk after. Yeah. All right. What's actually due from you next week is your proposal and your annotated article. So your proposal is literally just a few sentences. It just says the question that I'm going to ask or the research report that I'm going to write is X, and you just give me 2 sentences on what it is. So it needs to be as specific as possible. It shouldn't be just a general sentence. So you shouldn't say, I'm interested in the role of anxiety in second language acquisition. Okay, what about the role of anxiety in second language acquisition? Like, for example, I'm interested in evidence that shows whether anxiety in second language acquisition is facilitating or debilitating. Like in, for example, instructed language learning in adults. So that way you've got a nice sort of clear line on what literature you're looking at. You're looking for individual factors, in this case anxiety. You're looking for instructed language learning for adult learners, and studies that specifically address the ways in which anxiety has been tested as being either a positive force or a negative force. And then your final result of your review paper would be to really sum up those findings and to say, in general, it appears to be a positive force, or a positive force if it's X, Y, and Z, and a negative force if it's, you know, A, B, and C. So that's the kind of question I'm looking for. You should be able to come down to an issue that has a population and a context, right? So that you can get your literature nice and focused. And then what you want to do is produce 3 to 5 articles or book chapters. And at the top, right at the top of the page, you do a full APA reference right at the top. And then you do a few paragraphs covering the information that I've got written right there. Okay, which again is also in your syllabus. Okay, I need copies of those because I need to check that you've read the article in a way in which it should be read. That's part of my job, to help you check. So obviously those are, you're going to upload electronic copies of those unless you're here with me, and then you can give me photocopies. If you have 5, I don't necessarily need to see all of them, but I do want to see 3, okay, so that I can check that what you're pulling from the article is working well, okay? Any questions from the 2 people that I have with me today?
A summary of each article that we provide?
Yeah, for each article you're answering these questions. But it shouldn't be more than a few paragraphs, Diego. Just a page long. Yeah, for each one, not like pages and pages, okay? Make sure at the top you put your APA citation, and then you put it in there. Yeah, and again, the idea of those is not, well, it's partly to make sure that you're reading the articles in a way that's productive, but it's also to check that the articles that you're choosing and the question that you have actually are going together. Because if you have a certain question, then I have 3 to 5 articles or book chapters that basically don't answer that question or are too generic or whatever, then I can give you that feedback before you go too much further down the line, okay? Any other questions? All right, any questions that people have as you put this together, go ahead and either email me directly or put up questions as usual on the virtual office, okay? All right, so as I said, I specifically skipped over to this, so we're going to backtrack and go back to chapters 11 and 12, or 12 and 13. But I skipped this one because I thought you'd want to look at it before the proposals were due. Because another huge component of second language acquisition research is what we call non-language influences or individual differences, okay? So far in class, we've looked at language factors, so things like L1 transfer, developmental processes, and we've also looked at nativism, right? So that's the idea of the black box, or what we're genetically programmed to learn. That's the universal grammar that we talked about. But another very important set of factors is sort of this umbrella term called either non-language factors or individual differences, meaning individual differences between learners. And this is everything, as you now know from reading the chapter, it's a bit of a garbage can, right? It's everything from age, aptitude, motivation, anxiety, personality, social difference, cultural differences, and so on, okay? That's all bundled together under this term. And obviously, if you were going to do one of those for your paper, you'd want to pick one. You wouldn't want to do like a bunch of them. You'd want to pick one of those to look at, whichever one you found that was interesting. The reason that it's become more and more interesting for scholars in second language acquisition is because there's such variability in second language acquisition with adults, right? So why is it that some learners, adult learners here specifically, do really, really well and some do really, really badly? Okay, if we were all functioning from a very similar linguistic background, so either with the nativism or the L1 transfer or so on, we should look more like we're getting to getting to a similar spot, right? But very quickly that stops. That works up until a sort of post-beginner, mid-intermediate level, and then that stops. Then some people thrive and become near native, and some people crash and burn, right? So the question is, why is that? Because those two people might have had the same amount of input, they both might have been in classroom instruction, they both might have gone on the same study abroad program to Spain, you know, they both might have a lot of things in common. Is it because of something like a non-language factor like motivation? Like if it's me and Diego, Diego works harder because he's motivated in some kind of way. His motivation is much higher for whatever reason that might be than mine is, you know. So I'm sort of interested, but I'm not motivated to really have at it in the same way. And we know that in order to become near native, you need to really focus on it. So this research has become more and more mainstreamed as people try and work out essentially what makes an advanced learner. What do you need to be? What factors might go into it? And some of this comes from linguistics, some from psychology and psycholinguistics. And as you'll remember, this has been true for everything, right? SLA is a field that's sort of been cobbled together since the 1940s and 50s and taken little bits of everything with it. So that's the underlying reason of why people are often, and for other people, it's just more interesting, right? It's more interesting to think about, oh, and that's often because of your own language learning experience. Like my own language learning experience as a second language learner in instructed classroom learning in German was very stressful. I found it very difficult. I didn't, even though ironically German and English were supposed to be closer together, I really had a bad time. And one of the things that your chapter says is it looks like in classroom instruction, if you're unhappy, that's going to be a real problem. I had high anxiety, low motivation, yet in my French class, I loved it. So, you know, I went into German because I was doing so well in French that they said, oh, you should do another language as well. And then I hated German. So one of the reasons I've been interested in this in the past is because of my own experience. And this happens to a lot of people. So this might be something that everybody out there is also thinking, well, why did I, you know, why was I successful at this and not successful at that? For example, when I lived in Hungary and learned Hungarian in the wild, as we would say, learning in the wild is just meaning, you know, living every day and learning the language that way. I had a great time. I thought that was great. My learning wasn't that great, but I thoroughly enjoyed learning it. So there wasn't a high anxiety or anything else. So these are areas that individual teachers and learners often find interesting. So let's start with something that there's been a lot of work on, which is age differences. And does either of you remember what the CPH stands for? Yeah, you are going to need your book, so you should probably pull it out. So this stands for critical period hypothesis. Yeah. And this is something that's been talked about for a long time, okay, since the 1960s. And the critical period hypothesis says, essentially, this is from Birdsong, but a lot of people, this is a general definition. There's a limited developmental period during which it's possible to acquire a language to normal native-like levels. Once this opportunity is passed, the ability to learn language declines. So this is usually associated with the idea of the black box. Right, so the idea that there's a universal grammar, this black box, and after a certain point in time, this begins to atrophy. So if you haven't learned your first language, or you are learning a second language, after that point, then you will not be as successful. All right, so the first language idea would be someone like Jeannie, who was the girl who was tied to a chair until she was 13, then tried to learn English and couldn't actually figure out syntax. So, and then for second language learners, it would be adult learners. Now that age actually has varied. Someone like Krashen would say that atrophy starts at around 5 or 6 years old, whereas other people would say that it starts in puberty, whereas other people say it really doesn't happen at all. One of the problems with the critical period hypothesis is if that was actually true, what you should see is all learners doing fabulously until that cutoff point, and then suddenly them all doing badly. Do you see what I mean? There should be what's called a discontinuity jump. So everybody should go fine, and then suddenly there should be discontinuous line in their learning where all of a sudden this thing atrophies, right? And what we found is that that's not true. Learning carries on, and it might do different things. It might carry on upwards or sideways or whatever, but it doesn't suddenly drop to the floor. It doesn't sink like a stone. So a lot of people talk rather about sensitive periods, meaning that, for example, the CPH period seems to be really important for phonology, for example, for pronunciation, but not necessarily so important for things like morphosyntax, where, for example, studies have shown that teenagers are the quickest learners of morphosyntax. Children catch up with them very quickly, but teenagers learn it just as quickly, and if not quicker, for a certain amount of time. So when we talk about CPH, at this point in time, we're really talking about the evidence in phonology, which is pretty clear. That said, again, there's no, if you read some studies by Jim Flaggy or other people, he again argues that even in phonology, there's no sudden drop-off. People will continue to improve. However, not as quickly or as well. Now, this may be due to the fact that phonology is very much associated with our articulators, right? So phonology is something that we need to use muscle memory, and we also need to categorize into our hearing. We need to perceive the sound within a certain category. So it may be because of the particular nature of phonology as opposed to syntax, morphology, semantics, pragmatics, that it is more problematic when it comes to CPH. Anybody who's interested in looking at that for their paper, let me know. I've actually written a book chapter for Routledge on the argument of CPH and how that works with phonology. So that's something that you can start off with, and it has tons and tons of references that you can use. Regardless of all that argument, it is true that younger children do better when it comes to what we call ultimate attainment. And ultimate attainment means sounding as close to native-like as possible, right? So if we go to the summary on page 440, I want you to have a look at that. You can see that Michael Long writes about this. Well, actually, on page 440 is where we write about the CPH, right? So both the initial rate of acquisition and ultimate level of attainment depend in part on the age. There are sensitive periods governing language development. There is an age-related loss that is cumulative, not catastrophic. If that's true, that would account for the fact that there isn't a sudden drop-off, right? So over time, it gets worse. It doesn't just suddenly disappear. And deterioration in some individuals begins as early as age 6, which is something that Gratian argued, not at puberty. So these are the evidence for things like phonology that we can be very clear on. The next page, page 141, 441, gives you some examples on why it is that children's ultimate attainment might be better, okay? We sort of tend to assume it's something neurological, right, which may be true. And neurological changes is certainly one of the things that is in the list. But there are also social, psychological, cognitive, exposure to input, loss of access, use it, lose it, and so on. So there are a bunch of arguments that mean if you're talking about a child learning a second language, it's a completely different thing from an adult. So someone above the age of 17 or 18 learning a second language. Does that all make some sense? Okay. So these are some of the things now, what we're going to have a look at are some of the things now that people have said, okay, if we put aside for a second the argument about language and the black box, so the linguistic environment only, and look at some of the alternative factors, what might be the things that mean that somebody does better, one child with the same input? Particularly, this is when it comes to instructed input as opposed to natural acquisition. So we're really talking about instructed acquisition. So what makes one person do better than another person? So the first one that's been looked at quite extensively is something called aptitude. I think we have a sort of intuition about what aptitude is, but the definition that they give you here is potential for learning new knowledge and skills, one's ability to learn another language, not the L1. This idea of aptitude, for example, is used, and I think we have at least a couple of people that went through the armed forces, but it's there's a test that they use in the armed forces to test people for their language aptitude. So they will put things like phonetic coding tests and so on, and then they will test people and say, it looks like you have a high aptitude based on these tests for learning languages. So do you want to go into one of our language learning classes and so on? The most recent one is the MLAT, the Modern Language Aptitude Test, and you can look at that. That's quite extensive, and that's in your chapter. But there's essentially standard component skills that are used to test whether you have a greater aptitude or a lower aptitude. One is phonetic coding ability, and that's the ability to distinguish between sounds and tones. Okay, so the tests that are used for phonetic coding ability don't necessarily involve actual language. They might be just this series of tones, for example, that you need to repeat back. And your ability to be able to listen and distinguish those sort of gives you a greater or lesser phonetic coding ability. Grammatical sensitivity, so being able to connect functions and forms. Inductive learning ability, so being able to look at a sample of language or a sample of something else, some kind of test matter, and be able to make generalizations from the basis of those patterns. And also memory. A lot of people think that working memory, for example, is super important. So the working memory that's at the front of your memory capacity is super important for language learning. So essentially, you can come up with a series of tests that test these skills, and the better you do across the board, the higher your language aptitude is considered to be. Have either of you done any language aptitude tests? No, me neither. So I don't know, but there may be someone out there who has. A couple of things. It's not correlated with intelligence, and that's at least partially because we don't really sort of have good measures for testing intelligence to start with. So, but certainly none of these tests that we looked at here, the phonetic coding and grammatical sensitivity and so on, are to measure overall intelligence. They're to measure particular skills that might be helpful in language learning. One of the most recent tests is this huge test they talk about in your book, the Canal-FT test, which you can look at. It has been correlated in the past with things like social and environmental factors, meaning that aptitude could be, how am I going to put this? Basically, you might do better on these kinds of language aptitudes tests if you've had more experience of this kind of pattern building and so on as a small child. So I'm going to take a really simple example. I was just with my nephews and in England, and they are obsessed with Lego, and they just play Lego all the time. And I watched the 8-year-old, who's now at a point where he can look at what I consider quite sophisticated diagrams of what he's supposed to do with this Lego and produce pretty good, something pretty amazing. So there's a sense in which if these abilities and skills are not focused on when you're younger, then it may be that it's harder for you to make up that deficit when you're older. So in other words, if you have limited interaction with people and with objects and so on, then this might be problematic. And this has been correlated with what's called non-rich environments. So a non-rich environment might be a child who has no toys, who has very limited interaction with their parents, who has very limited interaction with other people, who has limited scope in terms of what they can experience, right? So that's what we mean by social and environmental factors, not overall intelligence factors. It could also be a combination of other factors, such as working memory or motivation and so on. So in other words, the more you want to do it, the more aptitude it looks like you have, right? It's a sort of what we call a virtuous circle, right? It's hard to tell what's pushing the circle. You know, is it the more motivation you have, the more you practice, the better your aptitude gets? Or is it the better your aptitude, the more successful you are, thus the more motivated you are, you know? So it goes around in a, and these are things that we'll come back to here too. But that's called a virtuous circle. In other words, it's hard to know which is pushing what, but it's likely that something's pushing the other. Learning styles, and I put this in because I know that a lot of people maybe, and also you guys may have spent some time in education classes with things like kinesthetic learning styles and multiple intelligences and so on. There was a bit about that in the 90s, but it hasn't really like caught on in second language acquisition research in the same way as something like aptitude, motivation, anxiety has. So there's quite limited amount of work on learning styles, and the authors tell you that it's essentially at this point a non-productive area of L2 research. That doesn't necessarily mean it should be, it just means that it is. L2 research has moved in a different direction. Motivation. Motivation involves 4 aspects, according to Gardner, from Gardner and Lambert: a goal, effortful behavior, a desire to attain the goal, and favorable attitudes towards the activity. Okay. And typically, that used to be measured in the 80s and 90s as either integrative motivation or instrumental motivation. So integrative motivation would be the motivation to just want to do it because it gives you pleasure, or you want to be part of a group. So I would consider this to be my motivation, for example, when I was learning French. I loved French. I wanted to be French. I wanted to go to France. I thought everything was awesome. Instrumental motivation is more utilitarian-based goals. So things like, I need to learn a second language in order to do X job or Y job. Okay, so I'm not necessarily interested in French culture or anything else, but if I don't become bilingual French, then I can't do the job that it is that I want to do. So obviously in the most cases, this is bilingual English or bilingual Spanish. So throughout Central and South America, essentially you've got to be bilingual Spanish. Right? If you grow up speaking just your local language, you've really got to work that out. And in many places in Europe at this point, you've got to be bilingual English in order to get, although that might change with Brexit now. What do you think people have found to be the most important of the two? Yes. Did you know that already? And why did you know? Because it said it in here, right?
It's well, we went over it in our previous class where it was a internal motivation versus extrinsic.
Right. That basically, over time, studies have shown that it's better to have an integrative motivation than a solely instrumental one, or to have a sort of a conjoined motivation. Again, using my example, I went into German class at school, and once I was in there, I had to pass it, because otherwise I would have failed it, which would have been bad, because I would have failed one of my O-level exams at school, right? So once I was stuck in there, I had a certain amount of instrumental motivation to pass the exams, right? And so I didn't fail my level exam at 16. But you know, it was painful, to say the least. Sal Atalo says the exact same thing about Greek. In his school, he had to learn Latin and Greek. He liked learning Latin, he hated learning Greek. But he had to learn it because he had to pass those exams. And his mother has actually told me that more than once he threw his Greek textbook across the kitchen in Milan when they were living there too, because he hated learning Greek so much. So so just because especially if you're talking about multilingualism, it doesn't necessarily mean you have the same reaction. And this is, of course, something we also need to think about when we're talking about post-advanced learners. What is it? Does it also have something to do with the language that's being learned? Andrew Cohen, who's someone at University of Minnesota, says he has learned like 15 languages or something. And in fact, Andrew Cohen might not be a bad person for you to have a look at, Diego. But he came and gave a talk for my class in Georgia State, and he said the one language he couldn't learn was German. And he put that down to the fact that his wife's parents, grandparents, and extended family were all killed in the Holocaust. So as far as he was concerned, that was his barrier for not learning. So that actually hasn't come up in your book, but I think based on my own experience and maybe based on other experiences that you know, there might be something to that. The only problem with motivation, and you'll see this if you decide to do this, look at this, is that it's usually measured with self-report. And self-report measures just means I give you a survey and you answer the survey. And in fact, you're going to do that as your discussion on something else this week. And as you do that survey, you'll probably realize that it's difficult to say what it is you think that you do versus what it is you actually do. And partly it's because when we take things like surveys and measures, unless they're very well constructed, we're usually trying to make ourselves appear as good as possible, right? So as nice as possible, as hardworking as possible, as honest as possible, etc., etc. So our answers are often biased in self-report. So your self-report measure has to be really clever to stop people sort of falling for that, you know, that issue. And it's a problem with motivation studies. The most recent model is from Donye, who is the king of individual differences. He's a Hungarian. He's been doing this for a long time, and he is, if you're thinking of doing any individual differences, you definitely want to look him up. He says that one thing that we've forgotten when we talk about second language learning is that it takes place over a long period of time, right? So it takes place, it's not something where, for example, motivation to take your GRE. How many of you took your GRE? Both of you, right? Did both of you take your GRE? So did I. I was highly motivated. So I sat in London and I knew I couldn't do my math. And so I hired my sister's friend, who was a high school math teacher, and he, you know, I was highly motivated to learn that math for the 3 months prior to the GRE. After I took the GRE, I abandoned any work with mathematics for the rest of my life. So language learning is typically not like that. Second language learning is typically not like that, as it takes place over a long period of time. And this is something that hasn't previously been looked at. So if you look at your book on page 457, that's where that model, again, if you guys are thinking, if anybody here is thinking of doing motivation, you want to move from these initial discussions of integrative and instrumental to these more complex models that take into account that there's a much longer period of time involved. And you can see that in your chapter. Questions? So far, so good.
Andrew Cohen, University of...
Yeah, Andrew Cohen is at University of Minnesota. Andrew Cohen is also, I think he's still involved with CALA, which is any of you that are going to do language learning strategies would want to look there. CALA, which is capital CARLA, just as you would spell the name CALA, but put it in capitals when you Google it, otherwise you'll get sexy CALA. Or you can put in the Center for Advanced Research for Language Acquisition, which is what CALA stands for. The Center for Advanced Research for Language Acquisition. Andrew Cohen has a lot of work that he's done in there. He's particularly interested in, because of his own experience as a multilingual learner, he's particularly interested in learning strategies and what makes people successful versus unsuccessful and so on. So he's certainly someone else that you might want to take a look at. Okay, it's tricky, right? Again, we've got this virtuous circle, right? The chicken and the egg, okay? We might assume that more success leads to greater motivation. But something called motivational arousal has been shown to be an important factor. And that literally means if you look at a task, how motivated are you to do it? In what? And one of the most important correlates with that is difficulty. So if the task looks way too difficult, motivation goes down. If the task looks way too easy, motivation goes down, right? What they found is that if you have something of moderate difficulty, motivation goes up. Psychological research has done a lot of work with motivation, and if you decided you were going to do motivation as part of your paper, then you're sort of right on that line between linguistics and psychology research. Dornier looked specifically at demotivation. Again, very interesting, something that people hadn't really looked at very much in those terms before on second language learning, particularly in an instructed setting. And if you go to 459, you can see this really good discussion of classroom motivation. Again, remember we're focused here on instructed learning. So the inevitable problems in classroom motivation arise when there's not a happy fusion between internal and external forces, but a negative tension, where the latter dominate at the expense of the former. Individual motivation becomes controlled, suppressed, or distorted by external forces. Now, I don't know if that's what happened to me in my German class, but whether it was me or whether it was a social dynamic in the German class, which I hated, as opposed to the French class, which I loved. But it's also true that I'm not sure if any of you have had this experience, but once it becomes collective, once you've got a whole room full of students who are ticked off for some reason or another, who are upset for some reason or another, what we call like collective motivation easily become demotivation. This happened to me specifically in Hungary when I was teaching the Hungarian teachers, because we were told that we had to teach them using the communicative language teaching method. And they had previously used only grammar translation with Russian. They were all Russian teachers who were Hungarian teachers of Russian. So they had basically 2 semesters, one summer, to change from teaching Russian as a second language to teaching English as a second language, because the wall came down. That was 1989, blah, blah, blah. A lot of them already spoke some German, because Hungary is right next to Austria. But they had learned German the same way they had learned Russian in grammar translation. And they were super unhappy when I tried to work with them with communicative language learning. They thought the little games that we did were stupid. They thought that I wasn't teaching them enough grammar. And there was one class in which I had a very bad problem student who basically, she refused to do anything. She refused to do partner activities, pair work. She refused to do group work. And she had a real impact on my class. I had about 25 students in there, and I hated teaching. Every evening that I had to teach that evening class, I hated it. I remember to this day this kind of pit in my stomach when I used to have to go teach that particular class. And it was, at least because it didn't matter how I came in, I felt the demotivation as soon as I walked through the door. It was horrible. And maybe I wasn't, I mean, I was very young. It was one of my first jobs, so I didn't really know how to handle it. But it wasn't good. So it may be that others of you have had that experience. I don't know, have either of you?
One thing that I just thought about is how there's this, like in a classroom, there's this continuous need to keep advancing, even if you don't fully understand something you've covered in the past.
Right.
Coupled with, being graded upon it. You don't always have to be right in the language to understand it or to be okay with it. But if you're graded on it, it makes you feel bad, and that's
right. It is a demotivating factor. It's true. It's true. And that applies to, I think, any learning experience. I'm on a roll of personal stories here, but this happened to me with horse riding classes.
Oh, I met Scott.
Scott.
I think that was his name. And you keep your horse.
George.
George. I met George.
Great. Yes. Oh, good. He's a nice guy, right? Yes.
He got a nice car.
He does have a very nice car. Yeah. He has a nice lot of things. I think he's doing perfectly fine out there. So there came a point where I had exactly that problem, that my horse riding instructor was bound and determined to have me keep moving forward to the point where I could even, jump. You couldn't just stop, right? You have to keep moving forward when you're learning something. And there came a point where I didn't want to do anymore, right? I just did not want to do anymore. I was too old to jump, and I, didn't want to do it. And she said, you've got to keep going because you have more control over the horse. The more, the better horsewoman you become, the more control over you have the horse, which I get completely, but I still wouldn't do it anymore. So, because I was completely demotivated by that point. I was like, I can't keep moving forward. I can come to a certain point and then I'm too terrified to sort of, so that's absolutely correct. Yeah. So motivation is interesting from a whole range of perspectives, and something, again, that you might want to look at. We're going to come back to, what we're looking at next is this idea of diary studies. So motivation is the kind of motivation I was talking about, where motivation or demotivation in German or Hungarian classes is something that's often tested using diary studies. So diary studies, basically, it's usually researchers that are investigating their own experience. So if you look at page 460 and 461, these are typical examples of diary studies. So this is a researcher who was learning Indonesian in Indonesia and was really having a hard time. She sounds super unhappy throughout the whole of her diary study. So she has a language shock, culture shock, stress, anxiety. Kathy Bailey, who came here to talk to us last semester, talks about her anxiety and competitiveness. I feel very anxious about this class. I know I am or can be a good language learner, but I hate being lost in class. I feel like I'm behind the others and slowing down the pace. Today I was panicked in the oral exercise where we had to fill in the blanks with either the past definite or the imperfect. Now I know what ESL students go through with the present perfect and the simple past. How frustrating it is to be looking for adverbial cues in the sentence when I don't even know what the words and phrases mean. So these, and then I realized the teacher was going around the room taking the sentences in order, so I tried to stay one jump ahead of her, working ahead. So this is a very standard way of looking at the effect of affect. Of course, again, we come back to this virtuous circle. If your emotional state is bad, then presumably that will have an impact on your motivation, right? So affect is typically measured with things like diary studies. It includes issues like language and culture shock, and anxiety, which again is something that's been divided into two: facilitating anxiety and debilitating anxiety. So it's the idea, and I'm sure many of you have heard this, that people say, oh, if you're about to go in an exam and you say I'm a bit nervous, people say, oh, that's good. It's good to be a bit nervous, right? Because you're likely to be thinking harder and do better. That's the idea of facilitating anxiety. Debilitating anxiety is the idea that you're so nervous you can no longer do the work that you need to do or concentrate on what you're doing, right? Where's the line? Is the line different for different people, and so on and so forth? Do you guys have any facilitating or debilitating?
Sorry?
Yeah.
I think for me right now, it looks like that's what this is what I'm going through really, because you get like, let me just use myself as a typical example. You come to school thinking that okay, I really want to learn and all of that, and then you get So it is here, like the United States, and then everything seems to be falling apart.
Ah.
I actually have a diary.
Ah.
Yes, I do. Like I would just write it. I came to class today, and it was really, really bad. You know, it's getting better, but man, was yeah.
This could be your way. This would be, especially if you're going through some language and culture shock right now. This might be a really nice way to engage in this class and sort of talk about, have a look at the literature in there. I would be totally up for that. That would be a I mean, you'd have to decide how much you wanted to. You wouldn't have to share your diaries, of course. But affect is anxiety is part of affect, or affect more overall is one of the areas of individual differences that's that could be super interesting. And if you're interested already, that's a great idea. Story time again. I played the piano from when I was 5. My mother was a piano teacher, and from when I was 5, I've been playing the piano, and I just couldn't perform. I had what is known as performance anxiety. I would play a piece beautifully at home, and then I would go onto the concert stage, even at 18 and 19, which is when I quit doing that. And I just couldn't do it. I would just fall apart and get it wrong and be shaking. And and it's interesting because it's never happened to me when teaching. I've never had that issue. So it's a different, I don't know what it is about the performance aspect of music versus the performance aspect of being in front of students. Even when in Georgia State, at one point I was teaching 120 students in one class. So there was me and there was 120 students in this massive class. Still, I was like, hey, what's up? You know, I mean, I just didn't have that kind of anxiety. I mean, obviously you have good days and bad days, but nothing like that kind of anxiety. Whereas I have a friend who is a professor at Alabama and has terrible debilitating anxiety. And she takes like half a Ambien or half a whatever it is before she teaches in order to be able to do that. So again, super interesting area that as an individual, you can think about how that might have affected you in the past or might be affecting you now. So mine was a good example of trait versus state anxiety, right? So trait anxiety, I have some trait anxiety. I get sort of anxious or nervous across different situations, but my state anxiety shows up when I perform on the piano, not in any other place, right? So even though I get nervous when testing and everything else, I don't fall apart. Whereas the state anxiety is so great in that particular situation that I fall apart. So again, very interesting. Obviously has very specific kinds of implications for language learning, right? I mean, think about instructed language learning. What implications would that have if you had strong trait or state anxiety?
Well, if you had a high level of trait anxiety, your stress levels in general would be higher, whereas with state anxiety, doing, like you said, that particular activity, you would just try to avoid it.
Right. But if it's something like testing, and you're talking about instructed language learning, you're kind of screwed, right? that's what you have to do over and over and over again, right? So this is going to mean that you never, whereas if you chit-chatting with your conversation partner in Spanish, you might be doing super well, right? But then as soon as it turns into a testing situation, you're not. So you're never, you never feel like you're actually producing the skill set that you have. Well, again, think of that virtuous circle thing. It means that this will affect your motivation, because it's like, doesn't matter how hard I try, whenever I'm in this environment, I'm constantly being tested in this environment, then this becomes a problem.